Welcome back. Hello friend, about 85% of the friends who watch my videos are not subscribed, and I would be really happy if you also don't forget to hit the like button and leave your comment. I thought camping in the rain would be peaceful. Just me, the sound of raindrops on the tent, and the quiet forest around me. I'd always liked the way rain made everything feel calm. But by the middle of the night, I realized I'd made a big mistake coming out here alone. The rain started in the afternoon, soft at first, then quickly turning heavy. By the time I set up my tent, everything was already soaked, including me. Inside the tent, I tried to dry off, but it was useless. The air felt wet, and my sleeping bag and clothes felt damp no matter what I did. I pulled out my small camping stove to make some tea and warm up, hoping it would make me feel better. But the sound of the rain hitting the ground kept pulling my attention. Something about it felt off. It wasn't just the rain. It felt like there was movement out there, small noises in between the drops. I tried to ignore it. It's the forest, there are always animals around. As it got dark, the rain finally eased up, but the silence that followed wasn't comforting. Normally, there would be sounds of frogs or crickets, maybe a rustling in the bushes. Tonight, there was nothing, just the sound of water dripping from the leaves. I crawled into my sleeping bag and tried to sleep, but I couldn't shake the quiet. It felt heavy, like the whole forest was holding its breath. Then I started hearing it, soft crunching sounds, like footsteps on wet leaves. Every time I sat up to listen, the sound stopped. I kept telling myself I was imagining it. Then I heard it, a scraping sound, low and sharp, metal on metal. My chest tightened as I thought of my car, parked just down the trail. If someone was messing with it, I couldn't just ignore it. My car was my only way out of here. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly unzipped the tent. The rain had started again, light but steady, making it hard to see. The beam from my flashlight bounced off the wet trees, but beyond it, everything was pitch black. I didn't want to leave the tent, but I had no choice. I threw on my rain jacket and stepped outside, my flashlight shaking in my hand. I tried to walk quietly as I made my way to the trail that led to the clearing where my car was parked. When I reached it, I froze. The driver's side door was open, and I could see a figure moving inside the car. It wasn't an animal. It was a person. My heart pounded as I ducked behind a tree. My breath came fast, and I tried to stay as quiet as possible. The rain covered some of the noise, but I could hear them. They were going through my things. I felt trapped. I couldn't confront them. I had nothing to defend myself with, and I was completely alone. But if they messed with the car, I'd have no way to leave. After what felt like forever, the person stepped out of the car. I could barely see them, just a dark shape with a hood over their head. They didn't run. They just walked calmly back toward the trail, disappearing into the forest. I waited until I couldn't hear them anymore before I moved. My hands were shaking as I made my way to the car. The inside was a mess. My backpack was open, my wallet and phone were gone, and my car keys weren't on the seat where I'd left them. I ran back to my tent. Locking myself inside like that would somehow help. I grabbed the small camping knife I always kept with me, holding it tight as I tried to think of what to do. I knew I couldn't stay there. Whoever that was could come back. The night felt endless. Every sound made me jump, and I kept looking at the tent's zipper, terrified it would move. When the first light of dawn came, I wasted no time. I packed up what little I had left and started walking the trail back to the main road. The hike was long, and every few steps, I found myself looking over my shoulder. The forest looked empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. It took most of the day, but I finally made it to the road. My legs were sore, and my whole body felt heavy from the fear and exhaustion. When I saw a car coming, I waved it down, nearly crying with relief when it pulled over. I climbed in, thanking the driver over and over. I hadn't even noticed the backpack sitting on the floor until we'd driven a few minutes. My backpack. I froze, my stomach twisting as I stared at it. The driver noticed and smiled, their eyes cold and unblinking. "You shouldn't be out here alone," they said, their voice flat and quiet. I didn't respond. My eyes flicked to the lock on the door. It was already down. The car didn't stop for a long time. I got hired to help a team studying dangerous snakes in a desert. It sounded like an exciting change from my usual boring routine. I wasn't a snake expert or anything, but my job seemed simple. Help set up camp, write down what we found, and collect samples when needed. The desert was huge, empty, and quiet, but it felt like it was alive in a strange way. The heat made the air shimmer, and the dry ground seemed to move in waves. We set up camp near a dried-up riverbed. The team leader warned me to always be careful since snakes were common around here. Our tent had medical supplies, including antivenom, just in case. For the first couple of days, I was super cautious, double-checking my boots and watching every step I took. But after a while, I got used to it and started feeling more comfortable. The work kept me busy, and I even started to admire how quiet and still the desert was. On the fourth night, I woke up to a faint noise outside my tent. It sounded like something moving through the sand. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then it got louder. I grabbed my flashlight, sat up, and froze. Part of me didn't want to know what it was, but I knew I had to check. I unzipped the tent a little and shone the light outside. My heart sank. A long, thick snake was sliding past my tent. Then I saw another and another. The light from my flashlight showed at least 4 snakes moving silently through the camp. They weren't just any snakes. These were rattlesnakes, their patterns clear as day. I slowly zipped the tent back up and sat there, heart pounding. But that's when I realized I wasn't alone inside the tent either. I turned the flashlight, dread filling me. In the corner, coiled tightly, was a massive rattlesnake. Its rattle buzzed softly, a low, dangerous warning. I didn't move a muscle. My breathing slowed to short, quiet gasps, and sweat rolled down my face. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. I knew the antivenom was in the supply tent, but getting there felt impossible. Outside, the noises grew louder. I peeked through a small gap in the tent flap and saw snakes everywhere. They were slithering between our supplies and crawling over our gear. It was like the ground itself was alive. The team leader had mentioned that snakes sometimes moved in groups when looking for water, and it hit me we had camped right in the middle of their path. I had to decide: stay in the tent and risk getting bitten by the snake inside, or try to make it to the truck parked about 50 feet away. The truck felt like my only real chance. I moved slowly, inching toward the tent door. The rattlesnake stayed still, but its rattle got louder, filling the tiny space with its eerie sound. My hands shook as I unzipped the tent just enough to slip out. Outside, my flashlight lit up the ground. It was covered with snakes, dozens of them, their bodies writhing and gliding through the dirt. I stepped out carefully, trying not to disturb any of them. Each step felt like a lifetime. I could feel my boots brushing against their cold, scaled bodies as I moved. My eyes stayed glued to the ground, making sure I didn't step on one by mistake. The truck was so close, but it felt like it was miles away. Finally, I reached the truck. My hands fumbled as I grabbed the door handle. For a moment, I thought it was locked. My heart nearly stopped, but then the door opened. I climbed in, slammed it shut, and locked it. I sat there shaking, watching the chaos outside through the windows. Snakes were everywhere, sliding over the tents, tangled in the supplies, completely taking over the camp. I stayed in the truck until the first light of dawn. As the sun rose, the snakes began to disappear, vanishing into the desert as quickly as they had come. I got out, my legs trembling, and went back to the camp. It was destroyed. The tents were torn open, supplies scattered all over. It looked like a storm had ripped through. I gathered what little I could, left most of the stuff behind, and drove away without looking back. Later, the research team confirmed we had set up camp on a migration route, a mistake that could have easily cost me my life. I never returned to the desert after that. Even now, every time I see an empty field or a patch of sand, my chest tightens. I know snakes don't think or plan, but that night felt different. They didn't just pass through. It felt like they had taken over, like we were the ones trespassing in their world. Sometimes, late at night, I hear that faint rustling in my mind, and I wonder if the snakes are out there, waiting for me to step into their path again. I'd been looking forward to this trip for weeks, a solo camping trip in the Australian mountains. I needed a break from the constant noise of the city, and this seemed perfect. The weather report said there'd be some light rain, but I didn't mind. I thought it'd make the experience more relaxing. I found a nice spot near a ridge, surrounded by tall eucalyptus trees. The view of the valley below was beautiful, even as thick clouds started to cover the sky. The air smelled fresh, like wet dirt and leaves, as I set up my tent. By the time I got inside, the rain had started, just a light tapping on the fabric. Felt peaceful. As night fell, the rain got heavier. The soft tapping turned into a loud drumming, and the wind began to shake the tent. I expected some of this. Camping isn't meant to be totally comfortable. But the cold started creeping into my sleeping bag, making it hard to relax. I kept telling myself this was all part of the adventure and tried to sleep. I woke up sometime after midnight to a strange noise. It wasn't the rain or the wind. It was deeper and farther away. At first, I thought it was thunder, but it didn't stop. It sounded like something big was moving in the distance. My heart started racing as I sat up and listened. The sound got louder, and soon, I could hear rushing water mixed with it. I unzipped the tent and shone my flashlight outside. Muddy water was everywhere, pouring down the slope toward my tent. My stomach dropped as I realized what was happening. A flash flood. I'd set up camp too close to the slope, and now water was rushing down, carrying sticks, leaves, and even small rocks with it. Panicked, I needed to move fast. I grabbed my flashlight and tried to pack up, but my hands were shaking so much I couldn't get it together. The sound of the rushing water grew louder, almost like a roar. Then I heard something worse. Sharp cracks and snaps like trees breaking. I scrambled out of the tent, slipping in the mud as I tried to get away. My flashlight beam shook wildly, lighting up the chaos around me. That's when I saw it. A huge tree had fallen across the slope above my campsite. It was holding back a massive pool of water. I froze, realizing what would happen next. If that dam of water broke, it would rush down the slope and take everything, including me, with it. My legs felt weak, but I forced myself to climb higher, slipping and sliding in the mud. The rain was coming down so hard it felt like needles on my skin, and every step felt like a struggle. I looked back just in time to see the dam give way. The floodwater surged downhill, tearing through my campsite like it was nothing. My tent, my gear, everything I brought with me, it all disappeared in seconds. I kept climbing, grabbing at the muddy ground with shaking hands, until I reached a rocky ledge. I crouched there, soaked and freezing, watching as the flood roared past below me. The sound was deafening, and the sight of it made my stomach churn. I stayed there, holding onto the rock, until the rain started to ease just before dawn. When the sun finally came up, the world looked completely different. My campsite was gone, replaced by a mess of mud, broken trees, and debris. My tent and gear were nowhere in sight, probably swept far down the valley. I sat there for a long time, trying to catch my breath. My whole body ached, and I felt empty, like I just barely escaped something I didn't fully understand. As I got ready to hike out of there, I couldn't shake one thought. If I'd waited even a few minutes longer to move, that water would have taken me, too. It wasn't just the flood that scared me, it was how fast everything had changed. One moment I was safe in my tent, and the next I was running for my life. I thought I had control, that I was just camping and enjoying nature. But out there, alone in the mountains, I wasn't in control of anything. Nature doesn't care if you're ready or not. It doesn't care if you survive. The world out there is bigger, stronger, and faster than we ever realize. And in that moment, it made sure I knew just how small I really was. We went camping because my grandmother loved being in nature, and my wife thought it would be a good way for us all to spend time together. We picked a quiet spot by a lake. It was far enough from other people to feel private, but not so far that we couldn't leave quickly if we needed to. The evening was warm, and the sounds of crickets and the soft breeze in the trees made it feel peaceful. The first night was uneventful. My wife and I set up the tent while my grandmother sat by the fire, humming softly and staring out at the dark water. She looked happy, like she was remembering all the camping trips she used to take years ago. The next day, we kept busy. We took a short walk, gathered some firewood, and spent time fishing by the lake. The area was very quiet. At first, it felt relaxing, but after a while, it started to feel odd. There weren't any birds chirping or small animals rustling in the bushes. It felt like the whole forest was still, almost like it was waiting for something. My wife mentioned how quiet it was, but we didn't think too much of it. Maybe it was just the time of year. That evening, as the sun sank behind the hills, my grandmother started acting different. She kept glancing over her shoulder toward the trees, her face tense. I asked if she was all right, but she just waved her hand and said she needed to stretch her legs. She slowly wandered off toward the lake while I added more wood to the fire and my wife worked on dinner. After a while, we realized she hadn't come back. I grabbed a flashlight and called out for her. The light from the fire didn't reach far, and beyond it, everything was pitch black. My wife stayed by the campsite while I walked down to the lake, shining the flashlight along the edge. That's when I saw her. She was standing in the water, her feet just barely covered, staring out across the lake. Her hands were shaking. I led her back to the camp, trying to figure out what she'd been doing, but she didn't say anything. She just shook her head, looking at the ground. That's when I noticed her shoes. They were covered in thick, wet mud, the kind you'd only find in the swampy parts of the woods on the far side of the lake. There was no way she'd gone that far in the time she was gone. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every little sound seemed louder. The crackle of the fire, the faint ripples of the lake, even my wife's steady breathing. I kept staring at the tent's zipper, half expecting something to pull it open. At some point, I must have drifted off because I woke up to a loud snapping noise. It was close, too close. I grabbed the flashlight and slowly unzipped the tent. The fire was still glowing faintly, casting long, flickering shadows on the trees. My wife and grandmother were both sound asleep, so I stepped out carefully. The snapping sound came again, louder this time. It sounded like a large branch breaking. I turned the flashlight toward the woods, and my stomach dropped. A man was standing just beyond the trees, right at the edge of the light. He didn't move. He just stood there, staring at me. He wasn't dressed for camping. His clothes were torn and dirty, and he wasn't wearing shoes. His skin was pale, almost gray. He didn't say anything, didn't make a sound, but his eyes never left mine. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like my chest would burst. Slowly, I backed into the tent and zipped it shut. I didn't want to wake my wife or grandmother. For the rest of the night, I didn't hear anything else, but I didn't sleep either. When the sun finally came up, I stepped outside, hoping it had all been a bad dream. But near the fire pit, I saw footprints. Bare, human footprints, leading away from the campsite and into the woods. We packed up right away. My grandmother didn't say a word the whole drive home. She just sat in the back seat, staring out the window with that same tense look she had the night before. Later that night, as I was unloading the car, I realized something was missing. My grandmother's walking stick. She always used it, but it wasn't there. I thought about it all night, replaying everything in my head. Early the next morning, before anyone else was awake, I checked the mud on her shoes. It wasn't the same mud from the swampy woods. It was dry, dusty, like the kind you'd find on an old dirt road. I had been working as a forest ranger for 6 years, and this wasn't the first time I'd been called to help with a search. But this time, it wasn't for a lost camper or hiker. This time, we were after a criminal, someone dangerous, wanted for serious crimes. Knowing someone like that was hiding in the woods gave me an uneasy feeling. Most people don't realize how easy it is to get turned around out here or how thick the trees can get. But someone desperate, someone trying to avoid being caught, that kind of person could be trouble. We started early in the morning. A team of officers and rangers set up a base camp deep in the forest. My job was to check certain areas, mark spots with flags, and report back. It felt different from the patrols I was used to. Every noise seemed louder. Every shadow between the trees seemed to move. I couldn't shake the feeling that the guy we were after might be watching us, hiding nearby, waiting to see if we got too close. By midday, I was sent to search an area near an old, overgrown trail that hadn't been used in years. It was thick with brush and branches that scratched at my jacket. The farther I went, the quieter it got. No birds, no wind, just silence. Even the air felt heavy, thick with the smell of wet dirt and rotting leaves. The only sound was my radio, where occasional updates from the team came through. After about 2 hours, I stumbled upon something that made my stomach drop. A small clearing appeared in front of me, and in the middle of it was a fire pit that had been partially covered up. Around it, trash was scattered. Empty cans, crumpled wrappers, and the torn remains of a sleeping bag. Someone had been here and not too long ago. I reached for my radio to report it, but before I could call it in, I saw something else. Boot prints in the dirt, heading deeper into the trees. I decided to follow the tracks. Slowly, I tried to keep my steps quiet, but every crack of a twig underfoot sounded like a gunshot in the stillness. The trees grew closer together as I followed the trail, and the light filtering through the branches got dimmer. My breathing felt loud in the silence. After what felt like forever, the tracks stopped near a rocky hill. For a moment, I thought I'd lost them, but then I noticed something. A small, dark opening at the base of the rocks. It was a cave just big enough for someone to crawl into and hide. I crouched down and listened, trying to hear if anyone was inside. Nothing. I thought about waiting for backup, but the idea of letting this guy slip away made me keep moving. I gripped my flashlight tightly and got my bear spray ready, just in case. As I got closer to the cave, a strong smell hit me. A mix of sweat, wet earth, and something metallic, like rust. It made my stomach twist. I shined my flashlight into the cave. At first, it just looked empty. But then the beam landed on a backpack shoved into the corner, with clothes spilling out of it. Next to the bag was a knife lying in the dirt. My heart started racing. I didn't see anyone, but it felt like someone was watching me. The silence was unbearable. Backing away slowly, I kept my eyes on the cave. I scanned the trees around me, trying to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Then, behind me, I heard it, a branch snapping. I spun around, shining the flashlight toward the sound, but there was nothing, just trees and shadows. I didn't wait. I turned and ran back toward the clearing, gripping my radio as I called in what I'd found. My voice shook as I described the scene, the cave, and the belongings inside. The team responded fast, setting up a perimeter and searching the area, but we never found him. By the time the officers swept the cave and the woods around it, he was gone. All we found were his things, the backpack, a few empty food wrappers, and that knife. It was clear he'd been there, probably watching me the entire time I was near the cave. That night, I stayed at the base camp. Couldn't sleep. Every little noise outside the tent made me jump. The rustle of leaves, the snap of a twig. It all sounded like footsteps. I kept thinking about that moment in the clearing, the snap of that branch. He had been close, so close. I've done plenty of patrols since then, but that day stuck with me. Sometimes, when I'm out in the woods alone, I get that same feeling, that someone is watching me from the trees. I tell myself it's nothing, just my imagination. But then I remember the tracks, the cave, the branch snapping behind me. And I wonder if he's still out there, hidden in the forest, waiting for someone else to come too close. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway. My sister, my dog Daisy, and I were just looking to get away from everything for a couple of days. We found a quiet spot near a small lake, hidden deep in the woods, about an hour from town. There was no one around for miles, just trees, the occasional bird flying by, and the calm sound of the water. Felt like the perfect place to relax. Daisy was off exploring, sniffing around and running in circles. My sister was busy setting up the tent, and I started collecting firewood. That's when I heard something strange. It was a crack, like a branch snapping. It didn't sound like it came from any of the trees around us, though. I looked around but saw nothing. I figured it was just a squirrel or some animal in the woods, so I didn't think much of it. Then, things started to feel off. Daisy suddenly stopped what she was doing. She stood still and started growling low and steady. She was staring into the woods, not moving an inch. I felt a cold shiver down my back, but I tried to ignore it. It's probably just a squirrel or something, I thought to myself. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. As the sun set and the light started fading, we made some food. I kept glancing around the trees, the darkening forest feeling more and more strange. Daisy's growling didn't stop. In fact, she started pacing back and forth, clearly agitated. It wasn't like her to act this way. It made my stomach turn, but I kept telling myself that everything was fine. Then I heard it again, a soft shuffle, like footsteps moving through the brush. But it wasn't the usual sounds of animals. It was slower, like someone was carefully walking around, taking their time. I looked over at my sister, but she didn't seem to hear anything. Her back was to the woods as she tended to the fire, unaware of the tension in the air. My heart was starting to race, but I didn't want to freak out my sister. I grabbed Daisy's leash and clipped it on quickly, trying to calm her down. My hands were shaking as I walked over to my sister, trying to act normal. "Let's just finish up here," I said. "We'll be fine." But inside, I wasn't so sure. Something was definitely wrong. The wind picked up, shaking the leaves, but it didn't help me shake the feeling of being watched. I tried to focus on the fire, but it didn't help. That's when Daisy went completely silent. She stood there, staring into the dark woods, her eyes locked on something I couldn't see. I turned to look, but the woods were just a wall of darkness. Nothing moved. Then I heard the shuffle again, but this time, it was closer. "Did you hear that?" I asked my sister, but she didn't even look up. She hadn't heard it. It felt like the air around us was getting heavier, as if something was in the woods, watching, waiting for something. My skin felt tight, and I could barely breathe. I grabbed my sister's arm and told her, "We need to leave. Now." She didn't argue. She could feel it too. The air thick with something we couldn't see but knew was there. We hurried, gathering up our things. As we packed, I could have sworn I saw something move in the shadows just outside the light of the fire. A tall figure, but before I could even fully focus on it, it disappeared into the dark. My heart was pounding as we rushed to the car. I kept looking over my shoulder, my senses on edge, but I didn't see anything. As I started driving away, I felt a strange relief, like I could finally breathe again. But then, as we passed the last curve in the road, something made my blood run cold. The headlights briefly lit up a figure standing at the edge of the woods, just outside the reach of the trees. It was standing perfectly still, staring directly at us, its shape clear against the darkness. I didn't stop, didn't look back. I kept driving, my hands gripping the wheel, the car's tires crunching on the road. But even as I drove farther, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, watching. I don't know who or what it was, but I can't forget that moment, that feeling of being watched. And what's worse, I'm pretty sure it wasn't the first time they'd been watching. It felt like they had been waiting for us to find that spot, to camp there. And whatever it wasn't done with us yet. It was just getting started. We'd been talking about this camping trip for months. It was supposed to be a quick break, just a way to get away from work for a bit. My brother-in-law, Jason, had invited me along, and somehow he managed to talk my boss, Mike, into coming too. I didn't really know what to expect, but I thought it'd be a good way to escape the daily grind and just relax with family. We picked a spot deep in the woods, far from any towns or even other campers. It was quiet, really quiet, surrounded by tall pine trees and thick bushes. I had been here before, but it had been a long time. The stillness was almost too much, but I figured that was just the nature of being out in the wild. We set up camp, spent some time fishing, and took a walk along a creek nearby. As night came, we sat around the fire. The sky above was dark, full of stars, and the only sounds we heard were the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. The air started to get colder, and I could feel the chill creeping into my bones. Jason was making jokes about how we might be the only ones out here, but he stopped mid-sentence when we heard something. A twig snapped far off in the trees. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just some animal, but Mike tensed up beside me. I could see him glancing nervously toward the woods. We kept going with our campfire activities, but I could tell Jason wasn't his usual confident self. He kept looking over his shoulder, like he thought someone was watching us. The fire dimmed, and the night air felt colder, heavier. That's when it happened. A rustling in the bushes, followed by a low growl. It didn't sound like any animal I knew. The noise was way too close. My heart started pounding. I looked around, but all I could see was the light of the fire flickering. Jason stood up quickly, grabbing a flashlight. Mike followed, his eyes wide, scanning the trees. I just stood there, frozen, feeling every muscle in my body tense. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move. It wasn't an animal. It was something bigger, a shadow darting quickly between the trees. I couldn't breathe for a second. What was that? Jason took a step toward the shadow, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The shadow quickly moved behind a tree and vanished into the thick woods. We all stood there, quiet, our fear settling in. After a long moment, Jason mumbled something about heading back to the truck. We started grabbing our things, moving fast but trying not to make noise. My heart was thudding in my chest, and I could hear the sound of my breath in my ears. The shadows in the trees seemed to be moving with us, always just behind us, as we hurried to leave. We didn't stop running until we reached the truck. The headlights lit up the dark, and we threw everything into the bed of the truck, not looking back once. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, like something was still out there, watching us. As we drove away, I glanced out the window. The trees seemed to close in around the campsite, and the shadows grew longer and darker. I looked at Jason and Mike, both of them staring straight ahead, their faces pale and tense. No one said anything. We didn't need to. We all knew that whatever it was out there, it wasn't just some animal. Something had been following us. I couldn't shake the feeling that we had stumbled into something we weren't supposed to find, something that didn't want us there. The further we drove, the worse the feeling got. I looked out the window again, trying to shake it off, but there was a chill that had nothing to do with the cold night air. It felt like the darkness itself had reached out to us, and I couldn't help but feel that whatever we had felt out there, it wasn't over. We didn't talk about it again. Not once. I don't think any of us could even put it into words. But I kept thinking about those trees, the way they seemed to move, the way the shadows didn't act like shadows. Something had been out there, and whatever it wasn't finished. I felt that it was still out there, waiting. I'll never forget that night. And every time I drive past a patch of dark woods, the feeling creeps back. That sense of being watched, of something not quite right. It stays with me even now. Sometimes, when I'm alone, I swear I hear twigs snapping in the distance, like it's following me. It might be years since we left, but that feeling hasn't gone away, and I don't think it ever will.